The European Union just passed one of the most sweeping immigration crackdowns in its history. Offshore detention centres, deportation raids without warrants, children detained, and detention periods extended from 6 months to 2 years. Some people have no time limit at all. Rights groups immediately called it the Trump playbook. But here is what they are not telling you. This story did not start in Brussels. It started decades ago, in Baghdad, in Tripoli, in Damascus, in Kabul. This is the story behind the story. Let us start with exactly what happened. On June 2, 2026, behind closed doors in Brussels, the European Union's 3 most powerful institutions, the European Commission, the European Council, and the European Parliament, finalised a landmark migration law. They called it a return regulation, a modernisation, a necessary reform. Here is what it actually does. It creates what they call return hubs. Detention facilities built not inside Europe but outside its borders. In third countries. In countries that the migrants being sent there have often never even set foot in. And where are these hubs being built? Mainly in Africa. At least 5 EU nations, Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, Denmark and Greece, are already in active negotiations with African governments to host these sites. Think about what that means. Europe is paying African governments to warehouse people that Europe does not want. On African soil. People who, as we will show you shortly, often fled countries that Western military interventions helped destroy. But that is not all. The maximum detention period for irregular migrants waiting to be deported has been extended from 6 months to 2 years, with a possible additional 6-month extension on top. And for anyone labelled a security risk, there is no maximum. Indefinite detention, no clock, no limit, no end date. Law enforcement across the EU can now raid private homes and hospitals without a warrant, without a judge's authorization. A knock on the door at any hour, and you have no legal shield. Under the old rules, if a migrant filed a legal appeal against deportation, the deportation was automatically paused until the courts ruled. That protection is now gone. Deportations can proceed even while the legal case is still running. You can be removed from European soil before a judge has even finished reading your file. And children. Children are now subject to detention under this framework. Rights organisations responded immediately. Amnesty International said the return hubs carry grave risks of rights violations and cannot be implemented in a human rights compliant manner. One human rights spokesperson put it plainly. Across the Atlantic, we see the violence and fear created by ICE's brutal immigration enforcement. Europe should be learning from the harms of that model, not building its own version of it. A Swedish lawmaker who helped draft the law stood in front of cameras and declared, "The era of deportations has begun. The era of deportations has begun. In Europe, in 2026. From the same institutions that spent decades telling the Global South how to govern. Now, before we trace the full pattern, I want to stop at something closer in time. Ukraine. Because it reveals exactly how the Western system operates and how it treats other people's countries as expendable. When the conflict in Ukraine escalated, the Western response was immediate and loud. Weapons poured in, billions in financial aid, satellite intelligence, ammunition, diplomatic cover. But here is what they did not do. They did not send their own soldiers. Not one NATO boot on Ukrainian ground in combat. Not one Western city asked to absorb a single bomb. Not 1 square kilometre of French or German or British territory was put at risk. They funded the war from a safe distance. They kept the fire burning on Ukrainian soil and Ukrainian soil only. Because the goal was never to protect Ukraine. The goal was to weaken Russia. And the most cost-effective way to weaken Russia was to let Ukrainians do the dying. This is not a fringe interpretation. Western strategic analysts said it themselves, in published papers, in think tank reports. The language was clinical. Impose costs on Russia. Degrade Russian military capability. Extend the conflict. Ukraine was the instrument, not the priority. So when millions of Ukrainians fled into Europe, when they arrived traumatized at Polish and German and Czech borders, they were not fleeing because of some natural disaster. They were fleeing a proxy war that Western governments chose to prolong rather than negotiate to end. And here is where it gets more revealing. Ukrainian refugees were welcomed with open arms, fast-track residency, work permits, housing support, school enrollment for children, right across Europe. Contrast that with what happens to a Syrian family, or an Afghan family, or a Somali family, the same continent, completely different treatment. And yet the Syrian war, the Afghan war, the Somali instability, all of them carry heavy fingerprints of Western military and political intervention. The difference in treatment is not about values. It is about proximity, race, and geopolitical usefulness. Now let us go all the way back, because this is where the story really lives. Over the last 70 years, across dozens of countries on multiple continents, the same sequence has played out so many times that calling it a pattern is being generous. It is a system. Step 1. Destroy. Iraq, 2003. The justification was weapons of mass destruction. The result, none were found. What was found was a country dismantled from the inside out. A state that had functioning hospitals, universities, a civil service, and an educated middle class was shattered in weeks. Over 1 million civilians dead. Millions more displaced inside their own country. The institutions of Iraqi society collapsed. The professional class fled or killed. The infrastructure bombed into rubble. Libya, 2011. NATO's air campaign toppled Gaddafi in months. The mission was called a humanitarian intervention. The result, no transition plan, no stabilization support, no reconstruction commitment. The country fractured into warring militias fighting over oil fields and territory. Today, in 2026, there are open slave markets operating on Libyan territory. Libya, which once had the highest Human Development Index on the entire African continent, has open slave markets. That is what Western humanitarian intervention produced. Syria. Years of proxy warfare. Multiple foreign governments funding competing armed factions. A country of 22 million people producing 6 million refugees. Cities that had stood for thousands of years reduced to rubble that still has not been cleared. Afghanistan. 20 years of occupation, trillions of dollars spent. The Taliban back in power within weeks of Western withdrawal. The country poorer, more unstable and more broken than when the intervention began. Vietnam, the Philippines, Cuba, Guatemala, Somalia, Yemen. Each time a different decade, a different justification. Liberation, democracy, counter-terrorism, stability. The language changes. The result does not. Step 2. Loot. Watch what happens in the months immediately after the military phase. Before the dust has even settled, the contracts arrive. In Iraq, oil production rights were restructured. Western energy corporations received access to fields they had been locked out of for decades. Reconstruction contracts went to American and British firms, not Iraqi firms rebuilding their own country. In Libya, the same dynamic. Natural resources flowing out under new terms negotiated at gunpoint. The country's wealth extracted while the country itself remained broken. This is not conspiracy. This is documented in corporate filings, government contracts, and investigative reporting. The looting follows the bombing the way night follows day. Step 3. Extract the labor. The people who survive, traumatized, dispossessed, with no functioning economy and no future at home, they move. Of course they move. You would move. Anyone would move. And when they arrive in Europe, they fill the roles that nobody else will take. The night shifts, the meat-packing plants, the agriculture fields, the underground construction. They accept wages and conditions that local workers will not, because anything is better than what they left. And quietly, invisibly, they have been subsidizing European economic output for decades. This is not charity. This is a labor supply chain produced by destruction, sustained by desperation. Step 4. Call them a problem. Now, after the bombs, after the resource extraction, after years of using their desperation as cheap labor, when they keep coming, when their children keep coming, when the next generation of a permanently broken country is still arriving at European borders, now they are the crisis. Now they are irregular migrants. Now they go into offshore detention camps on African soil. Now their children get detained. Now their legal appeals get cancelled mid-process. Now European lawmakers stand before cameras and announce, the era of deportations has begun. That is the 4-step playbook. Written in Iraq, practiced in Libya, refined in Syria, and now institutionalized in European law. This video is not here to condemn the West. It is here to show you what the evidence says, because evidence has no political loyalty. Here is the simplest test. Remove the intervention. What happens to the refugee? If Iraq is never invaded in 2003, is there an Iraqi refugee crisis in Europe today? If Libya is never bombed in 2011, are sub-Saharan migrants crossing the Mediterranean through Libyan smuggling networks today? If Syria is never turned into a proxy battlefield, are Syrian families sleeping in Greek detention camps today? These are not rhetorical questions. They have logical answers, and the answers all point in the same direction. Here is another number worth sitting with. After World War II, the United States launched the Marshall Plan, pouring billions of dollars into rebuilding Western Europe. Because American strategists understood something that seems to have been forgotten since then. Broken countries are unstable, and instability travels. So they rebuilt, they invested, they created conditions for recovery. No Marshall Plan was ever offered to Iraq. No reconstruction fund was opened for Libya. No stabilization investment was made in Afghanistan after the withdrawal. The countries were broken and then abandoned. And broken countries, left to collapse without support, produce displacement that lasts for generations. This is not an accident. Rebuilding a destroyed country creates competition. It creates an independent economy. It creates a state that does not need you anymore. Far more useful for certain interests to keep it dependent, unstable, and producing cheap labor. Once a country is destroyed at the level we are talking about, institutions gone, professionals fled, physical infrastructure rubble, recovery does not happen in 5 years or 10 years. It takes generations, if it happens at all. And without external investment, without the kind of committed support that was given to post-war Europe, it usually does not happen. The door to rebuild is never opened. Only the door to detain. Now, here is the part of this story that I think matters most. The people I am describing this pattern to, millions of them already live inside Western countries, and millions of them already see it. They are in the streets of London and Berlin and Paris. They vote for anti-war candidates. They sign petitions. They write to their representatives. They call out their own governments in comment sections and on public platforms. Because the truth is not hidden. The Iraq War inquiry in the United Kingdom concluded that the invasion was not justified. The Chilcot Report exists. The weapons of mass destruction lie is documented history. The Libyan intervention's failure is written into every headline that mentions Libyan slave markets. These are not suppressed facts. They are public record. What is suppressed is the connection. The mainstream conversation is designed to treat each crisis as separate, each refugee wave as its own isolated tragedy, each military intervention as a unique one-time event. As long as the dots are kept apart, the pattern stays invisible. But the dots are not apart. They connect in a straight line. And when ordinary people in Western countries sit with the full picture, the interventions, the resource extraction, the labour use, the detention crackdowns, they recognise it. They recognise it because they are not stupid. And they cannot unsee it once they have seen it. The problem is not awareness. The problem is power. And power does not reform itself. So let us be clear about what we are looking at. The European Union has passed a law to build detention camps on African soil to hold people whose countries' European and Western military policy helped turn into rubble. They are calling it a return regulation. They are calling it reform. From Brussels, it looks like an immigration policy. From Baghdad, from Tripoli, from Damascus, from Kabul, it looks like the final chapter of a very long story. Destroy the country, take the resources, use the labour, then build a wall and call the survivors a problem. This is not a theory. This is not speculation. This is what the historical record shows, repeated across decades, across continents, across different governments and different justifications. The same playbook, the same sequence, the same result. History does not lie. Mathematics does not lie. Patterns do not lie. And the same playbook used again and again for 70 years against some of the poorest and most vulnerable nations on earth. That does not lie either. The story was never about immigration. The story was always about who created the conditions that left millions of people with no country to go back to. Connect the dots.